Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Peugeot. The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Mediaclip, Advertech Printing, and Independent Photo Imagers.
Hello again and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Peugeot, and today we're joined by Gwendolyn Bounds, who is an author, journalist, and tech executive. Hi, Wendy. How are you doing today?
Gary, it's been what, 20? You did the math. How many years?
Oh, almost 30, I think. Well,
30?
I mean, we're going to get into that, but it's so good to see you.
It's good to be
You and
here.
I met in the early to mid 90s when you were a Wall Street Journal reporter covering Kodak, and I was back in my previous life as a newsletter guy at the Photo Marketing Association. And I think we met at the, we were talking about this earlier, the Atlanta PMA 1994, where Apple introduced the Quick Take camera. And we had a good fun few years there kind of competing for the same stories and sharing information about digital, early digital, and the advanced photo system.
APS.
The
APS, Gary.
Another photo system, I like to say. Let's give people kind of framework. How did you get into the journalism business as a reporter?
Well, you met me right as I was cutting my teeth in journalism. I was going to make a joke, since you dated us 30 years back, that you and I were both like, we were about 10 years old at that point,
at least,
I think,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
No, but it was my first job out of college at the Wall Street Journal. I started as an intern and then got hired in 93. And my beat, Kodak was a part of my beat because we kind of covered territories at that point in time. And I was based in the Pittsburgh bureau of the Wall Street Journal. And so upstate New York meant I covered Kodak, which by virtue of that meant I covered the photo industry. You know, you actually, I mean, I'm sure there have been many pivotal times in that industry since, as you have chronicled on your show and your newsletters. But boy, those 3 years of 93 to 96 when I covered it, those are pretty pivotal and interesting years. But I had always been a writer. I went to journalism school and I got really lucky to land an internship at a great place right out of school. And it led me to you, Gary. It led me to you.
It all comes back to me.
It all comes back to you, Gary.
So let's talk a little bit about those times, because that was a weird time because film was still king, but everyone knew digital was coming.
Yeah.
And it was a matter of where, when, and how. As someone who, was new to the beat, you were kind of embedded in Kodak for a while because they had the new CEO at the time, George Fisher, who was, kind of charged with transforming the company. What kind of briefings and prep did you get to take on that company? Because at the time, Kodak was a blue chip company. They were a big company doing a lot of things.
I still have ingrained in my brain, Gary, a report from an analyst, and I'm blanking on his name. He was like the analyst at the time. I have the name Mike in my head, but I can't pull his last name up.
Well, there was Alex Henderson.
Yeah, Alex. But this report, I literally remember a headline. Kodak's stock was approaching, like, I think $100 at that time. And it was like, ride the yellow train all the way to $100. And it was sort of at this point where Kodak, as you said, it was like, George Fisher had just taken over, and everyone sort of thought that the future held only big things, as often tends to happen. But this was right at that tipping point of when they were trying to make that initial shift to digital. And George Fisher had come in from Motorola, where he'd been CEO. Mm-hmm. And, I was very lucky. I didn't have a background in this, but I got very lucky to be briefed by my predecessor at the Wall Street Journal. But I also got to spend a lot of time with George Fisher, talking to him in the beginning. And he was very different from other CEOs. He often would just say to the PR people, you can leave us be. We're going to have a conversation together for dinner. And they'd be like, no.
Charlie Smith having a coronary, the veins in his neck sticking out, right?
Exactly. But he, it was I just remember they had the film plants. I remember taking the tours of the big film plants. And then I remember years later when they were blowing up the film plants, right? Or, and so, as you know, and I'll toss the ball back to you, but like George just couldn't get the company to turn that digital corner hard and fast enough. I don't think it was his fault. I think it's a legacy company that really was just kind of caught up in the cash cow of film. And it's really hard to make that pivot, as you know.
Yeah. Well, and that was exactly the point. I mean, like I said, Fisher was my favorite CEO. I mean, I was very fortunate in the fact I got to meet most of them in that era from Whitmore on up. And he was the most accessible. He would go to industry events and work the room and talk to people, and which was to his credit. He was a good, Midwest guy kind of approach. He didn't have the snootiness of the Sloan School Kodak guys, and he did have a large problem on his hands because it was a chemicals company. And if you look at what Fuji transformed themselves into, right, they're a chemicals company that does imaging. They kind of did it right, and Kodak, for whatever reason, whether it was because they were a public company and they had to make the quarterly earnings, or whatever direction, but they had much more trouble transitioning.
Yeah, I can, it's interesting you say, I mean, I think a lot of it now looking back, I mean, with the retrospect of that, as you said, 30 years or so, and having covered many more industries after that at the Wall Street Journal, this was my first. I now see the patterns that happen,
Right.
the cycles of sameness that get embedded in the way executives operate and the way companies operate. It becomes so entrenched and you can't break that. And it's not dissimilar to how we as just people and humans become entrenched in the same way of doing things, which is actually a theme in my latest book that you and I will talk about in a little bit. But I think that's one of the things that happened to Kodak, and one person can't do it on their own. And George Fisher was a huge change agent, but it just simply wasn't enough. But he was right. He was right to push them into digital. And you think what might have happened with Kodak had that pivot been able to have been made.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people certainly aren't printing the way they were, and that was where a lot of the money was. So it's interesting to see where the money could have come from. And I always argue with people who say things like, Kodak missed the boat. Well, you and I were both there in the early to mid 90s when Kodak was everywhere in digital. I mean, they were considered a leader. They were doing online imaging before anyone else. They were doing digital printing before anyone else. They were doing all kinds of things. In fact, they were tight with Apple at the time because of desktop publishing. And so looking back, they were a pivotal player in the technology. And then, of course, there was the advanced photo system, which we got to just touch on a little bit because a lot of people forget about it. But
Yeah.
at the time, that was a big story because you had the five major companies. You had three major camera companies, and Kodak and Fuji, basically operating in secret to develop a new film format. What was your perception on that in terms of, were you given like any kind of an indication that this was as big as it was going to be?
You're testing my brain for 3 decades back, but I still do remember that as being, and I remember it being one of the biggest stories, the announcement of that. I remember, I think it began with Kodak. I think Kodak was developing something called, I think it's like Project Orion or something that eventually led into this consortium.
Right.
And I remember they announced it and they had a huge investment, like hundreds of millions of dollars in
Almost
this
$1
system.
billion, just Kodak.
Is that right? Yeah, it was enormous. And I remember it was like this moment where part of the rationale for it, and Gary, you should correct me if I'm wrong, was that people loaded film incorrect. Like people had trouble loading film.
Right.
And so this was just like a cartridge you could pop in. And so I guess the question became, there just never was enough adoption, particularly in the pro market, for this thing to take off. It's a little bit like, was there really that big of a problem to solve, right, now that we look back on it?
I mean, from that standpoint, you're exactly right. I mean, loading film for people using 35 millimeter film was not a huge barrier.
Yeah.
I think they kind of pretended it was.
Right.
Kodak had a lot of agendas for APS, right? They wanted to make it a bridge to digital. People would have their film easily scanned, and it was all automated. It was also a smaller negative, so they could use less materials but still charge the same amount of money. So, there were all kinds of agendas there, which made it kind of a challenging product. And of course, it hung around for a while, but really digital, it never really beat 35 millimeter. And it really just kind of faded away, which is kind of sad. I mean, it was kind of a waste of money, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. But it paved the way, I think, for a lot of stuff that came later.
Well, there's a bigger lesson in it, I think, overall for businesses, writ large, which is if you're going to launch a new product that's solving a problem, make sure it's actually solving a problem that people think is a problem.
Right.
So if you think about, I mean, one might have said with laundry detergent, how hard is it really to pour laundry detergent into your washing machine? Right. And yet pods, like laundry pods have taken off, right? Because people really did. I mean, the saving somebody that time of like a busy, harried parent who's like trying to do 18 loads of laundry, that really proved to be solving a problem. Like many people hate laundry pods because kids eat them and they can be poisonous, but the adoption rate has been huge. Didn't happen with APS. It wasn't a big enough problem. And so I think that's just a very interesting business case to think about.
Oh, sure. Well, and the other problem that it had was the technology it was replacing, 35 millimeter, was pretty darn good, and it was universal, and it wasn't going to go away. I mean, it's not, the problem is they were still selling 35 millimeter format film and cameras right side by side with APS.
It was confusing. It was really confusing for people. And I think it was probably also for the retailers trying to devote shelf space and sort of figure out what allocation of their shelf space to give to this, which one to promote. I mean, it was it's kind of messy, but you know what? Like, they tried. Hindsight is 2020, or our 30 years.
There you go. You said you left the journal around 96. Where did you go from there?
I didn't leave the journal. I stopped covering the photo industry. I moved to, I actually was with the journal for 20 years.
Oh, that's right.
Before I left, because it was my first job out of school, and I was fortunate enough to be there through a massive transformation. And how, speaking of transformations.
Oh yeah, the media business. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, consume information. So I moved to New York in 96 and started covering a bunch of other industries. And I've been in New York ever since, and stayed with the Wall Street Journal through the transition to the web, and digital, and then into video and podcasting, and was lucky enough to have a lot of incredible jobs there until I made a decision to leave. And I went to Consumer Reports, another legacy brand, and I was their chief content officer for about 8 years before I, a couple of years ago, left to work for a startup. And I worked for as you mentioned in the intro, a technology media startup that's based in Tokyo called Smart News, which is a news aggregation app. So that's the TLDR short version.
The trajectory, right?
The trajectory, Gary.
So while you were at the journal, you actually wrote your first book. And I want to just touch on that a little bit, because, you were based in New York and 9/11 happens. And so your first book, The Little Chapel on the River, can you just touch on that? Because it wasn't really a memoir, but it was kind of a story about a place and time.
Yeah, it's both. It's a love story about a place, really. I lived next to the World Trade Center towers as of September 11th, 2001. And the Wall Street Journal's offices were right across the street from where I lived. And we all know what happened that day. And I was in the shower when the first plane hit the World Trade Center towers, and saw and heard the second one fly over my apartment building head. And we know what happened next. And I was part of the throngs of people fleeing. And I was incredibly lucky that, not only did I get out of there that day, and I'm here to be still talking to you, but my apartment building was shut down for 6+ months because a piece of the Trade Center went through my apartment building. And I ended up staying with some friends in a small Hudson Valley town about 50 miles north of New York City. And when I was heading back on a train to look for a new place to live, I wandered into this small Irish pub and country store that was right at the train depot on the river. Mm-hmm. One thing led to another, Gary, and one quick beer before I got on the train became hours talking to the old proprietor and the people at the store and at the bar. Mm-hmm. And I actually moved to that town instead of going back to New York City, and ended up going to spend time working at this pub and this country store and writing about the community's struggle to save this place, which was it was threatened by all sorts of business forces, right, that we now know threaten small businesses. Right. And that was Little Chapel on the River. And so it was about the people who came together, the human duct tape to keep it alive, and the story of my own transformation being there within its walls.
So how long did you live there?
Well, I'm still there. I still live in this town.
Oh, okay. There you are.
I a long time. I'm talking to you from that town. I mean, that's when I say transformation, it wasn't like, and now it's over. My whole life changed because of that time. And
You
I went
stopped
back.
for a beer, and look what happened.
Yeah, one beer turned into, I'm still looking outside, at the land where I had that, near where I had that beer. I went back to work at the Journal after I wrote that book and stay in that, but that's been my home base ever since.
Awesome. And so it sounds like you're going to remain there for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I have no intentions of, this is my home. It's been my home ever since. It feels like my home. I'm from North Carolina originally, but even though the pub and the country store that I wrote the book about has since closed, there are still many of the things that drew me here in the beginning. It's an antidote to career that's, as you know, in an industry that's a very hard charging 24/7 type of industry. And being here sort of and waking up and seeing foxes and, wolves and bears and things like outside my window, it's just grass and trees. It's a kind of an antidote to the rest of it.
Which kind of brings up work-life balance. And that's where I wanted to talk about your latest book, because that's really where it's like, oh my gosh, I've got to talk to Wendy about this book, because I think it resonates with a lot of people of a certain age, where you reach a point where you're middle-aged and you're like, think, is this all there is, or can I have more? So what was really the impetus for your latest book, Not Too Late?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Photo retailers, energize your sales with ShareMe Chat, the proven texting platform. Using chat to text on your website keeps your customers connected and buying. See us at Pro and IPI to find out why dealers using ShareMe Chat close more sales without adding staff. Find out more at shareme.chat.
I'm glad we're going to talk about this. And even though it may seem like you're taking a detour from what you usually talk about, I actually think there's a lot of tie-ins here because, you and I, right before you started the show, were talking about this notion of how you break the cycle of sameness, doing the same things every day, both as a human and, in work, we get programmed to do and think a certain way, which that all ties back to the beginning of our conversation here. But my book, Not Too Late, The Power of Pushing Limits at Any Age, actually is about my late in life journey to become a competitive athlete. I had been that scrawny last picked kid for sports teams growing up, the one who sat on the bench and passed out the Gatorade and the water to friends. I think, Gary, this will probably resonate with you and many of your listeners, but we gravitate in life toward the things people praise us for. So people had praised me as a young gawky kid for stringing words together. Nobody ever praised me for on the basketball court or the soccer field. So I became a journalist, and athletics and anything really physical was a side note. But through a story of something that happened that I talk about in the book, I ended up when I was 45 years old, starting down this road to become a competitive obstacle course racer. And obstacle course racing, for people who don't know what it is, it goes under brand names like Spartan Race or Tough Mudder. They've probably heard of these things. It is essentially cross-country running through very difficult terrain like mountains and fields and streams combined with obstacles like scaling an 8-foot wall, climbing a 17-foot rope, carrying 40, 60-pound buckets of rocks up and down mountains, very arduous, nothing I could have ever imagined. And yet that became a very integral part of my life. And that journey to transform in that way is a part of that book. And it's led to a lot of subsequent changes in my life professionally. And I think that's what you're getting at with your question.
So why that? Some people just take up fishing or something like that. I mean, what you just described is not what a lot of people would, if they're going to take up a sport late in life. I mean, pickleball is right there, Wendy. It's right there. Carrying 40 or 60-pound buckets of rocks up a mountain isn't the same thing. Was there something, were you a distance athlete before that, or were you
I
more
wasn't an
traditional
athlete.
sports
Yeah,
before?
I wasn't an athlete at all. I mean, the most I'd ever run, Gary, was like a 5K fun run.
Mm,
So, I mean, I maybe went to the gym enough to just justify my membership, but no, it was as much like it was the equivalent of my getting on a spaceship to Mars or singing at the Grammys. And if you ever hear me sing, you're going to be like, oh yeah, she's never going to the Grammys. So
right. Yeah.
it was really not something that people who knew me would have ever said, this is who she is.
Right.
But here's the thing, I think I've heard it said that if you can think about the things you were kind of made fun of as a kid and you
Mhm.
get good at it, then it can become your superpower. And
Right.
I never felt strong physically. I had always been drawn to athletes and athletics because I knew they imbued a sense of confidence in people. But the way I discovered Spartan racing, I mean, believe it or not, was through a Google search after a dinner party where that night at the dinner party, I'd heard an old man who was well into his gin ask a little girl there, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she rattled off all these amazing things like little girls will do. And
Mm.
that question, Gary, just stayed with me the whole night because I realized in middle age, nobody is ever going to ask you again, what do you want to be? And
Right.
you've probably stopped asking yourself. And so that next morning, I woke up and I was very unsettled still. And I still have no idea why I typed this, but I typed into Google, what are the hardest things you can do? And it spit back out to me, what are the hardest physical things you can do? And this thing I'd never heard of, Spartan racing, was one of them.
Right.
And the more I read about it and the more I thought, oh, this is so far out of my league, the more intrigued I got. And that
Right.
set off the journey.
And you've had some pretty substantial success at it too. How long did that take? Well, what was kind of the time frame there? You said you started at 45.
Yeah.
Clearly didn't happen in 1 year.
Oh my gosh. No, I didn't even get to my first race until almost 2 years later because life got in the way. I mean, we have all these intentions and then inertia set in. My mom got sick, my dog got cancer, work. I mean, anything you can think of. But there were enough little things along the way that got me at least just moving in that direction. And I talk about the how of that. That's, I think, applicable to anybody, whether it's obstacle course racing or fly fishing or pickleball, as you said, people who think, I want to do this, but I don't even know how to start. So I talk a lot about the tools and the tactics and the science behind that and Not Too Late. But it took me, I mean, again, my first race was at Citi Field in 2018. I fell 10 feet from a 17-foot rope and I collapsed in a heap and thought, this is the end. I'll never do this. But I ended up finishing that one race.
Yeah.
And something like just changed in my DNA when I crossed that finish line.
Right.
And I wanted nothing more than to keep going. And so
Yeah.
flash forward to a week and a half ago, I just got back from Sparta, Greece, where I raced in a 3-day world championship.
Wow.
In Sparta, Greece for Spartan racing.
Congratulations.
Thanks. It was my 53rd race. And I went there, and it's still, like when I say this sentence, it still sounds very strange to me. I went there ranked number 1 in my age group for the United States in Spartan racing. And I took 5th overall in the world. And so it's a long way from that dinner party and falling from a 17-foot rope. So quite a journey.
Have you thought about going back to find that guy who was half into his gin and say, look what you did? Or maybe just a little girl. Maybe you should thank her, right?
So the little girl probably is not a little girl anymore. And the guy, I mean, if he was still drinking that much gin, he's probably not around anymore. But yes, I owe them both thanks. I owe them both thanks.
So, it's funny. One of the reasons why I want to reconnect is because on a personal level, I've been gotten back into trail racing. I'm not competing on a world stage, but I can certainly relate to what you've been going through, right? Where it's miserable a lot of times while you're doing it. And then once you cross that line, you're like, when's the next one?
First of all, congratulations that you're doing trail racing, because trail racing is an inherent part of what Spartan racing is. I mean, We're trail racing with obstacles, and trail racing is so good for you because for so many reasons, not only are you outside and in nature, but you're also strengthening your ankles and the eccentric motion of going downhill. So congratulations on that. And I love what you said about people think like that people who do athletics, that you just love every minute of it. Oh my God. So it's so painful so much of the time, but you know when it's done, not only during the training,
Mhm.
it just changes. I mean, chemically, it changes how you feel,
Mhm.
changes how you move about the world. It organizes your day better. I'm
Mhm.
far more efficient now. And you're right, when you're finished with a race or a run, even if you're not doing it competitively, there's a saying that you know at the finish line. And
Right.
I always know at the finish line that the suffering was worth it.
It's funny you mentioned the fall from a rope. I had a race where it was a half marathon trail run, and I fell 3 times in the first 2 miles, tripping on a root and stuff. And my only thought was, so this is how today's going to go.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And then you just keep on going,
Yeah, I mean, getting back. I mean, look, you would, and you're also tipping on, like, I have to be careful at this
Right.
age. Like, I
Oh,
don't. I mean, right? Like tripping on a route when you're 22 is different than tripping on a route at 52. Right? It's a whole
yeah,
different ball
exactly.
game. But you are right that what a metaphor that is. You trip
Mhm.
on a route. Is this how today is going to be? All right. So this is my obstacle today, and how true we trip on routes in
Mhm.
business, and we trip on them in our relationships, and it's what you do after that. And I think that is one of the things that embracing something hard, and
Mhm.
in this case, in my case, it was a competitive sport at this
Mhm.
age, has taught me is that root tripping phenomenon, right?
Right.
What do you do then? What do
Right.
you do then? And it's just, you learn a lot about yourself that way.
When I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, which I do a lot for the podcast and in the business, that is one of the things I think where we can draw a parallel in that you should always be looking for something hard to do to either advance your career or for personal development. And I do think you kind of reach a point, maybe in your mid 40s where you need to make a decision, right? Are you going to coast on in or are you going to take it to the line?
I think I was coasting. I mean, for a little. I mean, it's not that I didn't. I had a very hard job, and it was a big job when I first started this, and when I was at Consumer Reports.
Hmm.
But I think I was getting sort of set in my ways and how I thought about problems, how I approached, new challenges at work. I just had patterns, which we all do. We all get patterns of how we do that. I think of it again as that cycle of sameness you and I
Sure.
were talking about earlier. And I think finding a way, and it's not going to be the same for everybody. Trail running is your thing, obstacle course racing is mine. For somebody else, it could be, learning to play the guitar. Something where you actually you're not the best anymore, right?
Right.
Something where you're not comfortable, where you're deeply uncomfortable, where you look foolish sometimes, where you fail, where you have a really good chance of not getting something right. It just breaks all those patterns. And it's like this whole new way of thinking, and your entire world opens up that makes you
Hmm.
people talk. I've heard somebody talk about the whole executive, WHOLE. And
Hmm.
I think about the whole person. And
Right.
that's what this did. And I think that's what you're getting at, Gary.
Yeah. So have you read, well, I'm sure you have, Atomic Habits by James Clear?
Yes.
Yeah. And a lot of that kind of folds into this, about breaking habits and establishing new patterns.
Yes. And I think you know, I read a lot of books, as I'm sure you do and your audience does. I think what's really important is then figuring out how you actually are going to apply them to your life. Because
Exactly.
I think I went through a period where I read a lot of these books, and sometimes I would underline them and I would take notes in a notebook, but I
Mm.
didn't have a new thing to apply. And I think having something new is very powerful when you reach middle
Mhm.
age, because otherwise you're just kind of like thinking, I'm just dialing it in and I'm getting closer to the end than the
Mhm.
beginning. And this not having newness is really dangerous. There's just tell you this number I like a lot, which is 7.5. And that number comes from a researcher named Becca Levy. She's at Yale, and she wrote a book called Breaking the Age Code. And she's found that people with positive perceptions about aging live on average 7.5 years longer.
Okay.
That's a long time, Gary. I mean, I'll
Oh,
take
yeah.
that 7.5.
That's
And part of
10% of most people's lives.
it's a long, right. That's a long, thank you for doing the math for us, because you're right. And that is, it's inclusive a will to live, of having pastimes that excite you, right? Having something new to wake up and think about
Right.
every day. And when you go to sleep, makes an enormous difference that I don't think people think enough about on their overall health journey.
So how much did your experience as a obstacle athlete inform your decision to take the jump into going into a startup?
A lot. And I think, and again, it's a little bit with retrospect. Now I've got 2 years to understand that. And I've gone through a process of writing a book, which makes you think a lot about the why of things. But, I don't know if I would have had, if I hadn't been doing something new and bold in my personal world, I'm not sure that the notion of giving up a very safe, comfortable job at an established older school company like Consumer Reports and moving into a tech startup where I'm one of the oldest people at the company and drinking through a fire hose, learning about AI would have been like, I think I would have been pretty nervous about it, or I would have taken the safer route.
Right.
But I don't feel that way anymore. And it doesn't mean I would never go back to a place like a Consumer Reports or a Wall Street Journal. But
Right.
I would, if I did, I would have a whole new vantage point,
Right.
and I would approach everything I did with a different lens. So it's a great question, Gary.
Well, thank you. So what's next in your career? Like you just, the running career. So, I mean, you just had the world championships and top 5 finish. So that's pretty awesome. So, I mean, is it just harder events? Because you always hear, like in the running world, people do things like, they have to do ultras. They got to longer events. They got to go across the desert or something like that. Is there a pinnacle event you're going to be shooting for?
So I should probably have a specific event for you if I'm following the pattern, but I don't. And here's why. Here's why. I wrote an essay about this for the Wall Street Journal. The journey of mastery at this age is one you're likely to never finish. I don't have the time to become the best obstacle course racer. I don't have the natural gifts, but boy, the experience of getting better and better and
Right.
and occasionally becoming among some of the best at my age has been quite profound. But I never did this thinking I want to be the single best obstacle course racer and when. I did this because something was missing. I had an itch I needed to scratch. I felt I had more left in my tank. This has done it. Like, I don't wake up feeling that anymore. And so it has changed my perspective on the rest of my life, where I see the old things in a new way and I'm much more content with them. So I think I will continue to race for sure. My goal this year is really, and I'm doing this through my Substack newsletter, Not Too Late, and through working with Spartan, is I'm trying to bring other people into movement, physical movement, I'm going to go with a lot of people to do their first race, not competitively, but there's something called the open category, which is non-competitive and much looser and easier. I want to bring a lot of people to experience something like that. And I will keep racing, but I'm also open to something new that might come. Like, I just feel like my aperture, just to throw
Going
that
back to photography, right? Here we go.
it's much wider. It is so much wider than it was 8 years ago. And that's a pretty interesting feeling.
So people are interested in checking out the book. Where's the best place to buy it? And do you do the audiobook yourself?
I 100% did the audiobook myself. That was its own endurance race of 4 days of reading 90,000 words into a microphone and then catching every little cough or stomach gurgle and having to do it again. But yes, so you can buy the book pretty much anywhere, any retailer, online. If you go to my website, which is gwendolynbounds.com, my name.com, you can find links to all the retailers, but obviously Amazon or Barnes and Noble or your local, your favorite local bookstore, hopefully they'll have it. It's pretty easy to find. And my Substack newsletter, you can subscribe to that off of my website too. And that just continues the conversation among a lot of really interesting people about the science and the tools and the tactics we all can use to embrace something new at any age, whether it's physical or otherwise. And so people who are interested in this theme we can keep having that conversation together.
Awesome. Well, Wendy, it's been great seeing you. Thank you so much for being on the show. Best wishes on your next event, and hope to see you soon.
Gary, I'm so glad I got to say the acronym APS again before I died. So thank you for that. It's great to be with you.
So much.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.